So excited to be here, like in general, obviously, but especially here with my friends you're going to hear from in a second. Bunch of brilliant storytellers with decades of experience between them, bunch of books. That fantastic display over there is thanks to these two ladies right here. Hopefully you get a chance to check it out. Yeah, this is a panel about storytelling. It's specifically called Representation and Solidarity, something too small for me to read, but you get the idea. My name is Kim Kelly. You heard a little bit from me yesterday. Some of you bought my book. Thank you. I'm a journalist based in Philadelphia, and I get to moderate this panel with all these brilliant people today. We're going to try and keep it to about an hour-ish, but we'll see. Keep it loose. The first thing I want to ask you all is if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you do so we can kind of get to know you. And I'll start with you, Libby. Just go straight on down the line.
Here, let's see. Never had to because I'm a big mouth. Unlike you.
There you go.
I'm Libby Lindsay. I live in Chapmanville up in Logan County. If y'all around from local, you know where that is. And I am very proud to have been a member of the United Mine Workers now for more than 47 years. And like most people who probably went into mines, I followed my dad into the mines. That's pretty well what I do.
Hey, my name is Merritt Moore. I'm now living in Jonesboro, Tennessee, but I cut my teeth in Mingo County. Back in 1977, I lived here for 4 years, and I worked at what then was U.S. Steel number 20, down Route 49, when people drove it more, and at Thacker. I spent time, I had to leave the mines after a year because of a family emergency that took more time. But I missed it so much that I started doing what I do like breathing, and that is documenting. And I started, hooked up with it. I knew the Coal Employment Project already in the late 70s, and began to photograph women miners underground and wanted to really spend serious time doing oral histories with the women who were working as part of the Coal Employment Project with which I was involved, and ultimately found undocumented workers and included those in the book that I finally did. But anyway, I worked for the United Mine Workers for 15 years. Went through Massey, worked Massey, was involved with Pittston, and it's been the joy of my life to do that work and to be here because you all have inspired me in new ways, and I just think there's ways forward no matter what, and I am motivated in Tennessee to continue doing this kind of work and working with my labor friends in Tennessee, which is a challenge.
Well, you can keep that one.
All right.
Hello. Man, it is truly an honor to be on this incredible panel with these incredible women. I'm just kind of stunned. And thank you all so much. Thank you to the museum for inviting us. My name is Maximilian Alvarez. I am the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network, a nonprofit independent news outlet in Baltimore. I'm also the host of the podcast Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today, where I've been having in-depth conversations with workers for many years now. I also guest host a labor segment for the news channel Breaking Points called The Art of Class War. I published my first book last year, which was a collection of 10 interviews with workers after year one of COVID, called The Work of Living. Working people talk about their lives in the year the world broke. Just a kind of quick summation of how I got into that work. I'll save this for maybe like the later rounds, but I did not grow up in a union family. I was a first-generation Mexican-American from Southern California. I was, in fact, raised quite conservative. I wouldn't say an anti-union family, but a non-union sympathetic family. There are a lot of complex reasons for that, right? A family that comes to this country wanting to attain the American dream, can feel like, we want to be more in control of our own destiny, and all that we had heard about unions was that we would have less agency to determine how far we went in our jobs, that kind of stuff. All of that changed in the recession of 2008. We lost everything in my family, including a few years later, the house that I was raised in. And this time, 11 years ago, I was working as a temp in warehouses and factories in Southern California, worked retail, service, was a pizza delivery guy, done a lot of low-wage jobs. But I started doing this work because my family was collapsing in on itself. And my dad, Jesus Alvarez, was slowly drifting away from us and disappearing behind this static that we couldn't penetrate because he was just punishing himself for having had and lost some infinite thing that he could never get back. And it was putting my parents' marriage on the rocks. Our family, which was always rock solid and close-knit, was falling apart. And so I joked that I almost started my podcast as a ruse to get my dad to talk about what we had gone through. And he was the first person I ever interviewed on season 1, episode 1 of Working People. You'll see Jesus Alvarez. It was up to that point the most in-depth and heartfelt and honest conversation I'd ever had with my father. And something about the recorder being on, something about other workers hearing his story, something about feeling like his story deserved to be told and listened to, made me realize how many of us don't have that, how many of us need that, and how, in fact, we are trained living in this society to feel like we don't deserve it. And so, like the incredible folks on this panel, like all of you, I've committed myself to rectifying that injustice and trying to remind my fellow workers that our lives do matter. We are beautiful, we have value, and our stories deserve to be shared.
Hi, I'm Jessie Wilkerson. I'm a professor at West Virginia University, where we're fighting for public higher ed currently. And I'm a member of West Virginia Campus Workers. I'm a historian and a writer. I wrote a book called To Live Here, You Have to Fight: How Women Led Appalachian Movements for Social Justice. And that project came out of a long-standing interest of mine in Appalachia, working class history, and the history of women, gender, and sexuality in the United States. And I wanted to tell stories about working class women's lives. But I also wanted to think about why those histories matter for us living under capitalism, like why they matter to our organizing. I want to shout out Barbara Ellen Smith because she modeled how to do this work. She's probably like working right now to make sure we have food. And let me just add my thanks to everyone here who's made this event happen, all the people who've been running workshops. So I just want to say briefly that women's working class history helps us understand critical issues. Critical issues about labor, but especially labor under capitalism. And the key point that I made in my first book, and that it really motivates me as a scholar and also just as a person who wants us to live under better conditions, is socially reproductive labor. And we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, as we talk about the women miners. So what do I mean by that? Well, Hayden told us about socially reproductive labor earlier when Hayden was talking about jobs make America and thinking about issues broadly, right? Thinking about housing, like thinking what it means to be formerly incarcerated in this country and what it means to raise children in this country. Jerry talked about it this morning when he said we need life after coal, right? He didn't say we need work after coal. He said we need life after coal. So, along with thinking about working class history, I think about who makes the worker. Under what conditions are we making human life? What labor goes into sustaining human life? And how can we make those conditions better? Thank you.
I do have a handful of questions I prepared, but just kind of springing off of some of what Jesse said and Max said, and just thinking about all the experience you have, I'm curious about how your work as a storyteller and as an archivist, as a saver of stories, how that made you think about yourself as a worker. Because you're talking to workers, you're documenting their stories, but you're doing that labor too. And I'm so curious to see how, how that sat with you internally. And whoever feels like talking can jump on in.
Stories, so we're wired, humanity, all of us are wired with stories. There's stories that we grow up with and we just take in from our parents, right? And then as we develop, we decide what stories are false. And if we're lucky, we find a broader story and we realize our lives are not just about us. Our lives are about, and stories of others, it's about as witness, it is about storytelling is organizing, an organizing tool. It is about stories as planting the seeds of the future. And so for me, when I began doing longer interviews, I was changed by every single encounter because usually they were 2 to 3 days I would spend with women in, beginning in Alabama, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, but more broadly later on, and I would spend time with them at their home, with their families, and then I would go underground with them. And I'm thinking of one woman in Alabama named Patricia Brown. And Patricia, Pat, when I met her and when we spent time at her home before going underground, she was African American, like a teacher or a healer, a quiet, thoughtful person. When she went underground, she was an Amazon. She told me, and she showed me, and I had a camera, she showed me the drawings in chalk of her breast that others had drawn to, of her. And she had a lot of other issues, but she hung in there. And what happened with these interviews is because after I did the first lengthy interviews with a number of women, then I got hired by the UMWA and I was just immersed, just working so hard. I was doing darkroom work for them. My dad had built me a darkroom when I was in high school, and I was doing darkroom work, I was doing writing. There was another real, longer-term mine worker on staff, but he didn't want to go underground, and I did. So I went underground all over the country and under the ocean in Nova Scotia. We had members in Canada. But what that meant was that I was learning from the union, my work at the union. I studied the old United Mine Workers journals. In the early 20th century, they were published, every journal was published in three languages, okay? And then, which meant there was a break between the times that I spoke with women. So I'd go back and see how things were going, how they had dealt with some of these obstacles, and then I had changed. And at the same time, which Libby will talk about too, the Coal Employment Project existed. There were two organizations. There was the United Mine Workers, there was and the experience, of course, the direct experience underground, but there was also the Women's Network, which was autonomous and yet worked closely with the union, and at times was at odds with the union over certain issues. This organization began when Betty Jean Hall, who was a lawyer, used some of her, she had worked with a consent decree to help women get jobs underground, but she realized that there probably were a lot of women in the country who wanted those jobs, needed those benefits, and needed support in getting in there and talking to each other. So in the end, there were support groups in every single coal state, all unique. Utah, you know, all over the place. The Navajo Nation, Pennsylvania, a kick-ass group. West Virginia, Alabama, I mean, numerous coal states out west, Colorado. And this was very important. CEP began by dealing with issues related to women, whether it's sexual harassment, pregnancy underground, and later the issue of parental leave. We led the fight for what became family leave more than a decade before Bill Clinton signed it, okay? And the United Mine Workers was really important because there were men who were single fathers who had children with cancer. And so it was not a women's issue. And therefore, CEP began to grow, and men in the locals began to go to the conferences. We had conferences, annual conferences, all over the country for 20 years. And unionists from other unionists would come in because the discussions really got so interesting about what was going on in this country. And Libby was very involved, and Kip Dawson, who many of you know, really involved in building not only national but international solidarity. We traveled, some of us found grants but traveled to South Africa, Russia, India, Mexico, the Maquiadoras, the Philippines, where else? China, yes. Yeah, China. So anyway, I guess I'm talking too much. But I'm saying it changed me. Yes, it changed me. Every time I spent time, I left different. I remember Bonnie Boyer in Pennsylvania, incredible woman, saying to me, discrimination takes 7 years to understand. And I thought about it almost like an immune system disease. It's like, first you think you got a cold and it's your fault, you know? And it takes time. At least it did back then. Maybe not now for all of you who are younger. Everybody's younger now than me. But, you know, and then you realize, this is bigger, and this is bigger, and this is bigger. And that was something that, there were just many things. There was so much wisdom. There was so much wisdom in the men underground, through the UMWA, through the whole strike situation, which we'll talk about later, but the Equal Employment Project, that stuff over there, that was us, wasn't it? I mean, this stuff, it still is. Everywhere we went, every conference, it was show and tell. We had fun, we had music, and that's important, to have that sense of celebration as you're fighting for justice, in the broader sense of the labor movement, as it was in the 1980s, an era of union busting. And so anyway, I'll shut up.
I really want to hear from Max and Jesse, but Libby, I feel like Merritt really set you up, Libby. I want to hear some of your reflections on this before we go to the other folks.
I came to my stories early on from my mom, because there were a period of time when she's raising 6 kids on her own, and we were daggone poor, wee doggies. She was working in a restaurant, 50 cents an hour in that day, and she said, people assume they can put their hands on you. Nobody has a right to put their hands on you. But she's in a position where she didn't feel like she could just slap them, which I would really have liked to have done. She instilled in us that we did not have to accept these kinds of things. Then when she married who I consider to be my dad, he was a miner, a union miner, and he couldn't read or write. And being the youngest of the kids, he'd say, "Little Lib, read me what this says here in the Mine Workers Journal." The Mine Workers Journal came in. I've read the Mine Workers Journal to him since I was 11, 12 years old. So there I got my stories. When I went in the mines, stories. But when I came into CEP, the stories that you get, it was like so similar, such a variety of people, such a variety of experiences, and yet all those threads just connected into this tapestry of stories where we are so the same. At one of the conferences, the women from the Navajo Nation said, "We always thought Anglos were soft till we came and heard y'all stories." And they're kind of like, "Geez, y'all are kick-ass." And I'm thinking, we ain't nothing compared to y'all, my Lord. We have not had to I have definitely not had to overcome anything that y'all have. So I think another way that I have come to my stories and that have kind of journeyed along with me is through music. Early this morning in one of the sessions, when the sister asked about recommendations for gifts, and you're talking about books, and such a book nerd. I'm just like, yeah, this title, I'm writing them down because I got to check on this. But music, a lot of what I have learned in my labor history education, I have learned in music. I would highly recommend Utah Phillips tells the stories and sings the songs of the Wobblies. So much good history there.
All right, Max, it's your turn. I know you have plenty to say.
I do. But so I wrote in a piece I published in Current Affairs a few years ago when I was just kind of starting out doing this work, that I started my podcast because I needed to feel less alone. And I found that it serves that purpose for other people as well. And that's why I'll always keep doing it. But I was thinking earlier today about what I meant when I wrote that. right? Because as I mentioned earlier, I did not come from a union family, was very much raised in a more conservative mindset of you will go as far as your feet will carry you, as hard as you yourself can work, right? And as a Catholic, that made a lot of sense to me, right? It was really up to my decisions and how I navigated the world, how closely I lived according to my principles and so on and so forth. And so much of that was shattered in the recession and the years that came after, because I remember working 12, 13, 14-hour days as a temp in these warehouses that were boiling hot, where, 80% of the workers there were temps, right? And we could be fired like that. And we were constantly reminded how replaceable we were, how lucky we were to be there. We were reminded every day that there were, dozens of guys waiting outside the gates at 5 a.m. in the morning to see if any of us didn't show up. And so, we better keep our heads down, we better work hard, we better not speak up, right? And so, and at the end of every day, no matter how long we had been there, in a very cruel sort of ritual that the managers would do every single day, when we were dripping in sweat, they would line us up in the warehouse, and I could still hear the manager's boots walking on the ground, and they would point to the people they wanted to come back the next day. And if you didn't get the finger pointed at you, then that was it. You had to go back to worrying about how you're going to feed your family. So I say all this because I see looking back in that moment, and I remember coming home from those days at work, and I would sit on the couch because I had no more strength to do anything else, and we always had the news on, and we were hearing about this recovery, that the economy was back and things were getting better while things were getting worse for us. And I just think about what that did to us mentally, to hear that, to see that, and to kind of look at our own lives and feel like, well, we must be doing something wrong. Like, we are the problem here because the rest of the country is recovering, right? And so that compounded that sense of loneliness, that compounded that capitalism-induced psychology that you are the only one going through this, and you alone are responsible for whatever pain and sense of like lack of self-worth that you have. And so we wouldn't talk to anyone about it. Again, my dad wouldn't even talk to us about it. He just kept sitting there punishing himself. And I think that what I realized was that we were all just, in the most literal sense, just getting by. Because it was too painful to sort of think about, questions of like, where do you want to be in 10 years? It's like, I don't know. I just want to get through the day. I want to get through the week. I want to keep a roof over my head, right? But there was always that hope that like once the bad times passed away, things would get better. And we would kind of come back to ourselves. The color would come back into our faces, and life would just kind of carry on as normal. And I realized in a terrifying moment that I could stay in that state until I die. And that is the state that most working people in this country now and in the past have been in their entire lives, is just getting by on the vague hope that something will change, even though deep down knowing that it probably won't, right? And so what I've learned about myself as a worker in doing the work that I do, because I never wanted to interview people about their work. I wanted to interview workers about their lives, right? I wanted to humanize our fellow workers. I wanted to not only show others, but even show the people I was talking to, right? Like how much beauty and knowledge and experience and life lessons that are just sitting caged in our heads because we never take the time, or seldom take the time, to turn to each other and talk about it. Like we've heard throughout the past 2 days, any organizer worth their salt will tell you, if you want to organize, the first and most essential thing you have to do is just talk to other workers. Listen attentively. So the question really is why? Right? Not just because by talking, by listening, you build a sense of trust, you build a sense of equality, you're there, you're present, you show that you care about them and their story. But also, for many of us, that we need that because we have been trained living in this society to feel like our lives are not worth talking about. And in fact, our lives are worth very little. And so the talking to each other is not just, again, about thinking strategically about finding those points of common connection upon which you could build a unionization campaign. The first primary reason we need to do that is because we need to deprogram ourselves and our fellow workers from thinking that we have nothing to say, and that this is all that we in fact deserve, right? That we still have a lot of work to do in that regard. I talk to people every week who say, "Oh, you don't want to talk to me?" I say, "Yes, I do," right? But so the point I'm getting at here is that what doing this work has taught me about myself is, and about the state of work in this country, is that that mentality is not an accident. That is an essential ingredient for our collective exploitation, immiseration, and to keep us in place, wading through a permanent present, hoping things may get better until we die, right? Feeling alienated from each other, like we're the only ones going through what all of us are going through. Because the more we stay locked in our own heads, the less that we come together in spaces like these. And that is exactly what the bosses want. And that is why I've learned in my own experience and in talking to so many workers over the years that the workplace is, a lot of social engineering happens at work. People in the workplace are made into subjects, right? It is a brutal schoolhouse where we learn how to be powerless, right? We learn that how to be, like we learn to accept that we should be paid and treated like shit. We learn to accept that this is all that we are worth, to accept undemocratic hierarchies in our workplaces that we have no right to challenge or question. We learn to accept by the ways that we are treated at work and the conditions that we live under as workers to feel constantly like replaceable cogs in a machine that was made by somebody else. Now think about everything I just said and how beneficial that is to a government structure that does not want democratic governance, right? Because if you feel powerless at work to challenge those hierarchies, you're going to feel powerless to have any say whatsoever in your own government. You're going to feel just as powerless when you're trying to have a say over these private corporations that control our lives, right? So that social engineering that breaks us down, that makes us, feel like the best we can hope for is just to get by, that plugs into all the other systems that oppress us. And so I think breaking that in the workplace where we all have to go and where we spend most of our lives is essential for fixing this broken world, because we first have to believe ourselves that we are going to be the ones who can fix it and that we deserve something better than this.
Same question, Jesse. Yeah, I mean, we could move on. We could talk about that. We have like, well, I guess you're probably gonna have some questions, right? Okay, all right. Well, then, if it's okay with you, Jesse, I've got 2 more questions. We'll battle it out. I'm interested, as someone who's like, I'm a writer myself. A lot of us are interested in writing or in producing or creating in different ways, and you've all used different mediums to create the work you do, preserve the stories you tell, collect the wonderful items that you've preserved. So I'm just interested in the way that, I guess, medium or format factors into the way that you tell stories, whether it's audio or oral histories, like I know some of you guys are working on, or writing or collecting, all of the different ways it goes in. I want to start with Jesse for this one.
Yeah, I'll try not to be distracted by all the sirens out there. Yeah, so this connects back to what Max was just talking about. So I work in oral history methods, and what I mean by that is listening to people recording their stories for the public record. That's a really important part of oral history for me as a historian. So meeting workers, working class folks, women who agree to an interview that we will archive in somewhere. Right now, it's working with the West Virginia and Regional History Center. Merritt and Libby are part of this project, the Women Miners Oral History Project. Yeah, great project. And I'll just tell you a little bit about how that project started. So Kip Dawson, who's also a retired miner, longtime activist and organizer on the left, she reached out, or I kind of learned about her during COVID, and then she reached out. She was really concerned about the retired miners, women miners in particular, who were sick, who were dying during COVID, whose stories might be lost. And at some point we got together, Kip, Merritt, Libby, Betty Jean Hall, and I, and we talked about starting this oral history project to preserve these stories. And so my approach to oral history is life history interviews, to Max's point. Not just going in and asking like research questions or about just one topic, but collaborating on these interviews. How did these women want to tell the stories of their own lives for the public record? What mattered to them? It's amazing, these sirens. So now we have dozens of interviews. Some of the women have done multiple interviews, right? Because it takes a long time to tell your life story. And we have an exhibit that's opening on Monday. So if you're in the Morgantown area, come out to the exhibit opening. We might have a parade just like this.
Come on. Who doesn't love a parade? Come on. Now they're literally going to come around that way.
Oh man, it's kind of sweet. It's ill-timed, but it's pretty sweet. I think
It's
that
great.
might be the end of the parade. I think they've
Yeah.
only got a couple football players in there. I think we might be good.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
good as
So
it's gonna
that's it. Oral history interviews, life history interviews, and it's rooted in this idea of the collective storytelling, collective memory. When you sit and you listen to somebody else's story, whether that's because you're an oral historian or because you're part of a campaign and you're listening to other workers' stories, you are then carrying that story in you, and that's incredibly powerful. I'm gonna leave it there.
You know, they heard about our panel. They're rushing to get over here. Gosh, well, you know what? It's fine. We can all be loud. Yeah. Please go for it, Mary. I know you can holler.
I just want to connect with Jessie because, in a way, you know, my approach was the same early on. So it was kind of chapter one of, the oral histories. And it was at the peak time when women were in the mines. You know, a total of about 4,000 women worked between, over the years. There were some who worked like Libby for so long, and there are people who've worked for decades who were never part of the Coal Employment Project. But the issue of the life histories and how life's changed. And so I had the opportunity to spend lengthy times, 5 or 7 years apart. And I want to talk about Mingo County and why it was so important to me. The woman who's on the cover of my book is Nancy Bowen. Nancy Bowen worked in low coal, and that is, below the level of your tables. And she worked with that is Randy, her older child on the cover, but the younger child, she worked until she almost had the baby in low coal. And her coworkers were trained in childbirth techniques. I mean, they were so freaked out. The boss was so freaked out. She made it to the hospital, and at the time, you know, I was told by her and others and her family, it was the fastest delivery in Mingo County history. But, you know, very little was known about what it took to be, you know, what pregnancy underground. I want to tell you about another woman named Brenda Brock, who is a really, continues to be an extremely close friend of mine. She's now in Michigan. She worked, how many of you have seen Harlan County, USA? All right. Do you remember the boss who smashed the camera? Basil Collins? Well, when I went to first meet Brenda, she was 7 months pregnant. She was carrying a 40-pound bag of rock dust. And Basil Collins was her boss. I mean, he was the mine, I guess he was the mine foreman. And so I was with Brenda, stayed with Brenda, and connected with her so much. And one night in the first interview, see, many of these women had never talked about working in the mines. They were working, trying to survive. They had never thought about it. They'd never reflected on it. And so, I mean, that's true for most of the women that I spoke with in those years, which would have been beginning in about 1980, and then to 1983, when I went to work for the United Mine Workers after Richard Trumka came in. But Brenda Brock, all night long, and her co-worker, Pat Estrada in Harlan County, we were over there. We were all smoking cigarettes. I'm going through, you know, hour and a half cassette tapes in the old days, right? My medium was cassette tapes and a little recorder and a camera, not as good as your camera, you know, the photographer, but it was an SLR and a notepad. Those were it was before the internet. It was before, obviously, cell phones. It was almost before the first Macintosh computer. In fact, we had the first Macintoshes when I went to the United Mine Workers. However, that night, Brenda and Pat Estrada, we stayed up all night. They had never talked individually, never thought about what it meant. And they were together, and it was the most amazing interview. All the interviews, in the book, there are about 24 altogether. I did 70 interviews over a period of 14 years. I mean, 70 women, some multiple interviews with those women. And I transcribed them all myself because I couldn't afford to do otherwise. So I listened to it afterwards, and listening and transcribing is really a spiritual experience, although it's exhausting. And the reason it is when you're listening to this audio, and Max and I have talked about the beauty and the intimacy of audio, when you're listening to it, you hit the pauses. You feel the nuance in ways that you can't when you're there with your equipment. And it was just an amazing experience. So I just want to say that one more woman in Mingo County who got me my job, helped me get my job, was Linda Thompson. So I was working in flood recovery at a nonprofit in Williamson, and she was flooded out, and she moved nearby, and she came in. She was so funny. She was like smoking and cracking jokes. She was a mine worker she worked on the tipple at number 20, but she and I she was like my big sister, and she showed me the ropes and helped me get my job in the mines. But she was still on the tipple. Her husband was a ramrod straight Korean vet who had congestive heart failure, but people were afraid of Harold in a way. I mean, she felt like Harold, even with his health issues, protected her from some sexual harassment because the superintendent and all of them knew Harold, okay? Well, when I went to the United Mine Workers, she and I had long conversations on the phone. And in 1984, we had a long conversation on Easter afternoon. And 2 days later, I'm in the basement of the UMWA at the Journal, and I get a call from a mutual friend, and he said, "You need to sit down. It's about Linda. She was killed last night." Okay. So she wasn't the first woman killed in Mingo County. Nancy Bowen, who's on the cover, her sister-in-law, she got her sister-in-law a job, Ellie Bowen, who was married to Donnie, and I think they had one boy. I mean, someone from here might remember that she had more children, but she was the first woman killed in the state of West Virginia. Okay? So I went to those funerals, and it's just a reality, and it's reality in every workplace, with the dangers of every workplace, that you're going to lose somebody you love. Hayden talked about that with her father, just knowing that, you know, it could happen at any time. So we have memorialized in the Co-Employment Project. Every woman kept a record of every woman who has been killed, and our brothers who have been killed or have died. And it's just a really close community, even for somebody like me, you know, who was doing more of the oral history work. So anyway, at some point I want to talk about the Massey strike and the connection with the Pittston strike, but I'll do that later.
Okay. Before anyone else jumps in, I think we have, what, like 15, like 20 minutes? Is that the vibe? We have 15 minutes. Okay. Well, I want to hear so much from all of you, so much. But in the interest of letting some other folks hear from you, if you really, really wanted to talk about the connection you mentioned, maybe we'll take like 5 minutes for that, and then we'll open it up. Unless Libby wants to jump in. I feel like you were trying to jump in, Libby. Because I want to listen to you guys all night, but we got to be respectful of the schedule.
No, what else I want to come up with is that one of the important ways that I gained stories and told stories, and still do, was that through the union and through the Co-Employment Project, we were able to travel a lot, as Merritt said, and offer a lot of solidarity. When you go to offer support from somebody, just to hear their stories, and you think, you know, we went up to the strike against Hormel Company, waves of strikes in meatpacking in the 80s. 80s was a hard time for unions, as I'm sure you all know. And I'm thinking, what would I have in common with meatpackers beyond the fact that, you know, they're on strike? But their stories were so similar. So those connections, those stories, you're able to learn, teach, share. And the other thing with those stories are that they have to be true. We can't just sugarcoat. When Terry said this morning that the Massey strike was a shit show, you ain't kidding. Yeah. Lord have mercy. And we have to be honest about that. When they say Pittston was this great victory, it was better. It wasn't perfect, nothing is. And I think we need to be honest about that. A few years back, I had this, I only brought a few of them, a huge tote of t-shirts from various strikes and, you know, social justice movements and campaigns that I have been fortunate enough to be involved in down through the years. And one of my great nieces was visiting, and she's going through them, and she's like, what happened with this? Well, this company no longer in existence, or, well, the strike was broken here. And I'm like, oh, this doesn't sound real promising. I'm not sure I'm encouraging her here. But one of the plates that I brought from the Women Against Pit Closures reads, We stood, we fought. If you stood and you fought, you have not lost.
That's right.
All right, I could ask you questions all day, but I don't want to be greedy, and I know there's a lot of people here that have questions. So, who would like to be the first victim? This person. Oh, I should. Here, you. Yeah, I'll do this now.
So we've talked a lot about nonfiction, but do you think there's value in writing historical fiction about the movements, particularly from the lens of the young organizers today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The beauty of fiction is that you can work with all kinds of materials to create a world that others can engage in. I mean, fiction is really, I'm trying fiction, but I absolutely think, yes.
I will 1,000% second that, not just because in a past life, or I have 3 degrees in literature. So like, I'm like, you know, when I was working at the warehouse, I was like, well, this is what 2 degrees in Russian literature gets you, right? But, you know, like there's a great James Baldwin quote that I'm going to butcher, but the essence of it is, when, you know, when you're young, you feel like your heartbreak is the most intense that's ever been felt, that your pain is the most, you know, intense that's ever been felt, and then you read, right? And there's something incredibly liberating about finding that connection through fiction, and really through anything that you read. But that, for me, that was fiction. I often tell people that my path out of conservatism and towards being the lefty nut job you see before you went through literature, right? It was people like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Gogol who like allowed me to see outside of my own head and to sort of empathize with people who lived in times and places so different from mine, and yet were feeling things so similar to what I was feeling, right? And I try to like capture that type of connection that fiction always gave me in the work that I do now, right? Because we're telling stories and we're asking others to tell their stories to us. So there's always a bit of creativity and narrative structure, and even, you know, like some what we might call fiction that bleeds into that. You know, the great Studs Terkel said that, you know, there's a difference between fact and truth, right? Maybe the person you're talking to is telling you a very important memory that happened on a Wednesday, but they are positive it happened on a Thursday. Or maybe some of the details are a little fuzzy and have been colored in retroactively. But there is some truth about that experience, some that they are trying to communicate to you. And I think that, you know, what fiction allows us to do, like Merritt said, you know, like is let that truth, you know, sing up from beneath the floorboards, right? And I think that any ways that we can connect with one another through these stories, whether they be fictional or not, the whole point is, again, to sort of remind us that we're not alone, that it's not just us feeling this way, and in fact that there is a vast world outside of our own heads.
Yeah, the Russian literature nerd to lefty labor writer pipeline is very real. Like, right there with you, comrade. Do we have another question?
Yeah.
Look, you've seen the guillotine. Well, I see a person back there with the kerchief. Oh, well, okay, this is my job now. I'll run this way. You're doing this wrong. Oh, no. How good are you at catching?
Thank you. So you guys are on the forefront of history, both making it, documenting it, and letting people see it. First of all, thank you for that. And second of all, my big question for all 4 of you is, when you go about like picking the stories that you think are representative of these big issues, you know, how do you do that? What's your methodology of creating the historiography here?
I'd like to respond to that in terms of strikes and stories. And I want to, again, as Libby did, to honor, Terry and every Massey striker who went through such a difficult time when, the union tried, but it was a shitstorm, and it was a tough defeat. The union learned from that, and it was the lessons of Massey that led to Pittston. The most important thing that happened at Pittston was that we had a year to prepare for it. Unlike Hayden, a full year. It was really important. So the contract expired. Mine workers kept working, but there was a whole year of education. At the local level, in the mine, it was work to rule, and there was a lot of training that went on, okay? There was informational picketing all year. Then I had tried at Massey to talk with the strike organizer to involve the women, the wives, and the children. And I was kind of shut out, okay? But at Massey, one thing, I don't think I said this to you, Terry, but I went to somebody's beauty parlor, and we figured that was a safe space. And so the women came to the beauty parlor, and I talked to them just about the strike, answered their questions and that sort of thing. But at Pittston, because of what had happened at Massey, I had approached the union again about the importance of involving and organizing the women, the wives and the families. I mean, there were women miners, not a lot at Pittston, but there were women miners. But they went for it. And I was able to, great good fortune, to hire, on lost time wages, the union to hire Cosby Totten, who was a leader at CEP from Southwest Virginia. And then another woman who had never been part of CEP, who was also laid off. So Cosby, Catherine, and I hit the road, and we started organizing auxiliaries. They didn't have any really functioning auxiliaries. We ended up organizing, I don't know, I have the full list in that scrapbook, but there were, I don't know, maybe 8 auxiliaries in Southwest Virginia then. So during this year, they worked, and they decided that they wanted to organize their communities. They had parades and rallies and worked with all the merchants. There were yellow ribbons everywhere during this first preparatory year. So when the strike was finally called in April of 1989, I was called, and this was the upside and the downside of being an employee, being on staff, okay, but also being very involved with the Co-Employment Project. Through the Co-Employment Project, I had learned a model of organizing that was collaborative. It was based on listening and finding out what people wanted to do, and to answer their questions and to go from there. And the union tended to be more top-down on a need-to-know basis. You need to be here, you need to be doing this. So it was a different model. So we were working on a collaborative model, and when the strike happened, we did, as Jim Sessions said, we all had to read, all the staff had to read, and we went through nonviolent civil disobedience training to prepare for this strike, because that was going to be a strategy. And we all had to read Parting the Waters. It was our pleasure to read it, actually, and to think about the lessons of the civil rights movement. So I was called in to talk with someone who was kind of a mentor in the building for me, and was told that they wanted the women, the auxiliaries, to be the first do the first act of civil disobedience in the Pittston strike. So we met, Cosby and Catherine and I, and it happened very quickly, and it was edgy. It was kind of risky. So what we did is we gathered sort of in a secret place. 40 women showed up, including some women we didn't know. That's a risk, right? A woman who was pregnant, but they were related, and we really talked about it. And we said, we're just going to go with it, all right? So camouflage was a protective apparel, right? It was protective because the company and the guards, all these armed guards and the state police, they couldn't identify anybody because everybody was dressed alike. Well, that included women. Women turned camo into sunbonnets, skirts, I mean, everything. We had turkey veil, camouflage turkey veil. We had our outfit, okay, when we went in. We went in, we had American flags. There's one in that, my American flag is in there. We went into the headquarters of Pittston in Russell County. That was where the Vance Security Group was. And, you know, they were the guards. They were in the back of that building, and we knew that. We go in there, and we went in with the intent of being arrested. So, but before we went in, we knew that if there was going to be media coverage and that women could not be identified, it would hurt their husbands, it would threaten their husbands. So we were like, I think it was Cosby that said, what can we call ourselves? The Daughters of Mother Jones. So we numbered off. So we had numbers, okay? I was number 35. Edna Sauls was number 14. She was our spokesman. We went up to about 40, all right? So when CNN showed up, we walked in there. This is what happened. We walked in there, and they were like, the woman at the desk said, can I help you? And we just started singing, We Shall Not Be Moved. And so then, you know, we started having, you know, they heard about us. So CNN was in there and other local stuff. And they came in and they said, who are you? You know, they said, Edna was going to be our spokesman or spokeswoman. And she said, I am the daughter of Mother Jones, number 14. And then they had to turn off the audio and turn off the video, the camera. And they said, who is Mother Jones? And we realized that we had a sound bites for every single, we did education on Mother Jones for everybody. So we danced, we sang. The men were gathering at the bottom, the husbands and the strike organizer, Marty Hudson, and all of them. And there was a man named Gail Gentry who was in a wheelchair. He'd been involved with the full year of picketing. And he brought up, and you know, he pushed himself mostly up that hill. He brought love notes to us, love notes to Mother Jones here from the husbands and the families and the children. You know, number 32, number 2, and so he brought all these love notes, and then they brought us food, then they brought us blankets. So we were there overnight, and what we did, because we knew Vance was there, is we did what the Occupy movement did, right? Except we sang. Whenever we had to really talk, we knew we were being eavesdropped on, and so people could really start singing labor songs. And anyway, so we only were there one night. I got the message because I was, you know, the staffer, you know, and that we were to come out the next day. And that was not a happy time because we wanted to, including me, we wanted to get arrested, right? So we walked out, we sang, we held hands, and there was a huge reunion at the bottom. After that, there was civil disobedience, major civil disobedience. 4,000 arrested, the jails were filled. Women were involved in all kinds of ways. You know, some of them would go out there and turn around those little rural roads signs so that the guards and the state police. But anyway, all I'm saying is major civil disobedience. And then for us, we were able, the union was able to do massive civil disobedience for a while until they started levying $40 million fines. But we were better off than Hayden. Hayden, who's local at Warrior Met, they couldn't do that because there was a law passed that it would be a felony if they did that. So we have to watch all the ways in which all the states are changing the ability of labor to do any kind of peaceful protest in mass. We have to work on that. Anyway, Massey and Pittston didn't, it wasn't, as Libby said, it wasn't the great victory. It ended, it was tough in the end, but there was tremendous creativity in the rank and file. All these T-shirts, probably 36 or so different T-shirts were created by local people at camo shirts, and there was poems. There's poems in that scrapbook. Edna started writing poems. There were songs. What Jim Sessions said about religious, the Free Will Baptist strikers, when things got really tense on that with those mass civil disobedience, they would start kneel and sing Amazing Grace, and it would calm everything down. So I'm sorry I've talked so long, but the lessons, I think, of Pittston are the incredible creativity and the celebration. There were so many ways in which, in the early months of that strike, it was just popping. It was just, the ideas were popping. And because we had all these auxiliaries, they were doing all kinds of work. Camp Solidarity, let me say 2 minutes on the real Camp Solidarity.
We only have one.
Okay, so
60 seconds. Let's go.
Okay, Camp Solidarity was bought for like $1, and it was bunks, and there were thousands of people who came through. It was a free space, the only free space of the strike. Pickets, union pickets, vetted everybody. That meant that there was the possibility, people came from Siberia, all over the country, all over Europe, Poland, Siberian miners. Anyway, it was an intense, incredible experience, and I remember sleeping there and all the snoring, men and women, and it was wonderful. Sorry.
All I can say is I cannot wait for the episode of Max's podcast where him and Merritt just go and go and go, and I'm gonna drink in every second because you're all amazing and incredible, and I'm so excited to have been able to hear your stories. And I'm pretty sure if anyone wanted to ask some more questions of the panelists, we'll probably be hanging out for a little while, so we can all just have a good chat after the red bandana ceremony, which is, I think, our next event, right? Do what? Oh, well, all right. I think my job here is done. I'm going to hand this over to the man in the very cool shirt from Kentucky.
Thank you again to that wonderful panel. Let's give